Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And very, very excited to have James M. Stone with us. Should be an interesting talk indeed. A brand new work called 5 Easy Theses, Commonsense Solutions to America's Greatest Economic Challenges. I can tell you about James Stone. He's the founder, chairman, and CEO of the Plymouth Rock Group of Companies. Began his career by teaching economics, and after earning a PhD in economics at Harvard, he served as Massachusetts Insurance Commissioner from 75 to 79, and then as chairman and commissioner of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission for 4 years. And on his return from Washington, he founded Plymouth Rock. He is a former member of the board of directors of the Boston Globe, et cetera, et cetera. Interesting talk indeed. Jim, how are you, my friend?
I'm good and glad to be with you. And yes, call me Jim.
That we will do. Well, let's do this. Let's start with this premise. You do not put a work together like this unless you feel there's a problem. And in this particular case, you feel you've got some very solid solutions. Give us, if you would, our Lewis at Large listeners, the overview of where we sit right now in America regarding the economy and what needs to happen.
Sure. I had, as you mentioned, a bit of an academic career and then a government career for 8 years, and I felt I had a good bit of unfinished business to do because it became clear to me that our political system is not really geared to solving the hard economic problems. It'll solve the ones that resolve to sound bites or the ones that you can describe with easy fixes, but the ones that are really tough, our political system doesn't seem to be very good at these days. So over the years, I've thought about these 5 big issues that we're not solving. And eventually I decided to take some time and write a book and see if I could propose solutions that people might respond to, even if politicians don't.
Why do you think, and it will take a little bit of a turn here and talk politics briefly, but in this political presidential election year, why is this country, why have we arrived in 2016 as one that is so culturally and philosophically divided?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, I think that the country has been divided before, that there are cycles that a country goes through, a democracy goes through, of general agreement and sense of common thinking, and then there are periods in which there isn't any of that, and this is one of those unfortunate ones where there isn't. I don't think that it's the worst the country has ever had, but it is one in which we're not going to solve tough problems.
What about, again, let's draw on your experience not only in the private sector but also in Washington. Do you feel that the private sector is farther away philosophically and maybe spiritually from our friends inside the Beltway than ever before, or is that a misnomer?
I think that probably is not the case. That one thing that has happened, though, is that finance, rather than industry, has taken the major role with Washington. So if you count finance in what you just said, well, finance is very close to Washington, and they pay a lot of attention, and they're actively involved, and people from finance go into government, maybe too often. But industry, I think, has moved somewhat away and feels somewhat alienated now. And actually, I think industry's probably gotten a raw deal compared to finance.
Do you think that, again, and if we get back to the work, the challenges that we face today, should we have seen them coming? How long have they been coming? And again, we're not here to point fingers or blame necessarily, but what conditions caused this, so to speak? If we are what we were, what led us here?
Well, the issues that I aim for in the book that I wrote, the imbalance in the budget process, the national debt, our inability to honor our Social Security commitments unless we make changes, increasing concentration of wealth, making education more useful to both of those who are going to go on to college and those who don't, overspending on health care, and curbing the financial sector. All of these are problems that I would say have gotten much worse in the last 20 or 30 years. If you go back before that, the lay of the land was pretty different. So these are problems that have emerged, around the time the average person in the country was born.
What about as you did your research here, and this not only includes research but also just the practical, political, and business life that you have led? When you laid out these 5 premises here, do you find that do you believe that you would find a lot of agreement not only amongst economists but also your friends in Washington as well?
Probably not. I would say that I'm getting a great reaction from people who are not in Washington, and I'm getting a good reaction from people who are interested in the economy and knowledgeable about the economy, but I would say probably not as much from professional economists. I do think that people have been lulled into this notion that we can't fix these problems and that we have to do tiny little things or wait until there are crises to fix things, and that the people who are actively involved today are actually less likely to fix a lot of the problems than the public should want them to be. The public's going to have to drive the politicians towards these answers. Sometimes it works the other way. On these issues, I think the public's got to do the driving.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. And, of course, we're in the midst of some Smart Talk Radio with James M. Stone. Brand new work called 5 Easy Theses, Commonsense Solutions to America's Greatest Economic Challenges. James M. Stone is the founder, chairman, and chief executive of the Plymouth Rock Group of Companies and a former Massachusetts insurance commissioner, along with being the former chairman and commissioner of the U.S. Commodity Futures Commission. Jim, we are dealing with, in this particular political career, issues of immigration, foreign policy, defense spending, domestic spending. Where do these the concepts that you're talking about, whether it's income inequality, education, healthcare, physical balance, etc., where are they in the priority list? Because my sense is if we're not dealing with the issues you're talking about, the rest seem almost irrelevant. Well,
my view is that there are problems that our leaders must take on because they present themselves, and foreign policy has that characteristic. I don't deal with that because I don't know what will present itself. I don't know what the foreign policy challenges of the next period will be, and I'm not an expert in that area. But these are issues that we have to solve. We have to solve them because each one of them has a fundamental role in what kind of society we have economically. And what's made the United States a remarkable country is the combination of an unusual democracy, successful democracy, and at the same time a very prosperous economy, the most prosperous economy in the history of the world. If we're going to keep it up, we have to solve these issues, and as I say, they're the ones the politicians in general are afraid of, as they don't lend themselves to sound bites and they don't lend themselves to quick fixes. Concentration of wealth, making education work for everybody, what we spend on health care, reigning in Wall Street. These are tough issues, but they have answers. They have logical answers. Unfortunately, the logical answers are generally not the answers that come with campaign contributions. They're things you have to do for the country. And so politicians have to look, I call it swimming upstream. They got to swim where the campaign contributions are not urging them to swim.
What, in your opinion, what did we learn or not learn from the housing and economic crisis of 2008-2009? And if we did learn, again, specifically, what are we doing differently, better? And if we didn't learn, what mistakes are we continuing to make?
Well, the irony is that the big lessons are exactly the same as the big lessons from the 1929 crash and the depression that followed it. And in that era, they did learn the lessons right. And the lessons are simple. The lessons are, in order to have a healthy financial sector, you've got to have lots and lots of disclosure, as much as possible, and as little leverage as possible. You want to keep down the leverage, which makes the system unstable. That is the borrowing to leverage up a position and make it move faster up or down, has got to be limited, and disclosure has to be increased. Those were the right lessons. They were learned beautifully at that time, and for 50 years they worked. They gave us the best financial markets in the history of the world. Now, the lessons are the same, but we're not doing those things. We're not limiting Wall Street's leverage, and we're not in any significant way increasing disclosure. Hedge funds should have to disclose exactly the way mutual funds disclose. The banks shouldn't be able to the top 10 banks hold $200 trillion worth of open futures positions. That's 3 times the world's GNP. They can't be doing that for a commercial hedging purpose. That's leverage. Those things need to be controlled, and we don't seem to have learned those lessons, or at least we haven't acted on them.
Well, I know you're not here to endorse anyone in particular, but are there or is there a candidate, or have there been candidates in this presidential cycle that you believe had a pretty good bead and you felt comfortable with as far as their view of the economy?
Nobody who is in politics now has wanted to touch some of these issues. For example, I think we need to get rid of the deduction for interest, both the corporate interest deduction and the mortgage interest deduction. Nobody would dare to take that on during a campaign. Nobody's talked about how to fix Social Security in a really serious way. And concentration of wealth or making hedge funds disclose, that runs against campaign contributions. So far, it's not that the candidates are beyond what we normally expect from a candidate in an election, but they haven't wanted to deal with these tough issues, and I'm not surprised. I don't blame them. I don't think that these issues would help them politically in a campaign. But somebody is going to be president of the United States, and I hope that person is going to deal with these issues when they get there.
Talk to us a little bit about the issue of Social Security. We've got a lot of baby boomers listening to this show. They're thinking, oh, no, not my Social Security. Tell us what needs to happen there, in your opinion.
Well, we've made big promises in Social Security, and they're promises that we won't be able to keep unless we make some changes that nobody really wants, but that are required. When the eligibility age was set, people lived into their 60s. Now people live to be about 80. I get involved with a lot of scientific work. I'm on the board of a science lab on Long Island, and we're going to make a lot of progress in the treatment of cancer. People are soon going to be living regularly into their 90s. We can't pay them for these decades-longer periods without changing the system in some way. So probably we should have a gradual increase in the eligibility age, the retirement age that's built into Social Security. Nobody wants to face that. It shouldn't affect the baby boomers now. But the key is, if we wait until the last minute when there's a crisis and Social Security runs out of money, we'll have to make the adjustments quickly, and that'll be really painful. If we start doing it now, we can stretch it out over a long period of time and make it gradual and, as close to painless as possible. It's tough medicine, but it needs to be taken.
What about, and again, only in the interest of time, because we could explore Social Security for quite a while, just that issue, but what about the general premise that you talk about, income inequality? Put a little bit of a sharper point on that for us, if you would, and describe that.
This is a year in which people are talking about angry voters. The voters may not know this statistic, but I think I can tell you why they're angry. The median income in the United States has not increased at all since 1974. That's the first time in American history that anything like that has happened. And it's not that the country hasn't created a whole lot of wealth since 1974. It has. It's just all gone to the top. It's the first time that's happened. It's an accelerating trend. We're already where we were in the so-called, the Gilded era, after the robber baron era, that time. And we're headed towards even more unequal distribution. So, of course, people are feeling that they didn't recover from the recession. They're not gaining. And they're right. And we need to fix that.
You're the chairman and chief executive of Plymouth Rock Group of Companies. You're former insurance commissioner, former chairman and commissioner of the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission. You're sounding very politically and financially liberal, and that is a label. But let's just talk about that. I wonder, when you're sitting with your contemporaries, are they saying, "Jim, you're crazy," or are they thinking, "You know what, the guy's dead on right"?
Well, my liberal friends are upset that I'm suggesting raising the Social Security age, and a lot of them are upset that I'm suggesting getting rid of the individual interest deduction on mortgages. So, this is a book that upsets some of my liberal friends and some of my conservative friends. But on the other hand, I found surprising support from both liberals and conservatives on it. So I'm hoping that, like the title says, I talk about common sense solutions, that people will say these may not be things that we want to jump at because they're fun, but they're things that need to be done if we're going to preserve the kind of productive and fair and decent country that we're also proud of.
What about, and this is a big one, let's talk healthcare here. I know it's a gigantic subject that you could talk about for quite some time, but in a nutshell, give us your take there.
Sure. Healthcare is not bad in the United States. That's not the problem. The problem is that we spend 18% of GNP on health care. Nobody else spends more than about 10. That difference of about 8 points is over $1 trillion a year. Now, that is a big number by any standard. And we spend it every year for something we don't get because our health results are not better than the countries that spend 10. And they're not better on any of the measures that you'd want to use for that. They're not better in life expectancy, infant mortality, healthy lifespan, obesity, morbidity statistics. We're not doing better, and we spend $1 trillion more than we need to. So we have to rein that in. And that one involves taking on tough issues. There's too much diagnostic testing, a lot of that driven, I believe, by defensive medicine. There's marketing and administration costs that any kind of unified payer system could get rid of. We're probably the only country whose policy seems to be to drive up pharmaceutical prices instead of down. And we have an end-of-life care problem that's really serious. But, end-of-life care is incredibly expensive and incredibly complex to figure out what to do with. But as a start, we could ask people when they're healthy what kind of end-of-life care they want and then honor their requests. We hardly ever ask them, and sometimes the hospitals don't honor their requests. We can make progress in these issues. And there's a lot to be saved. There's no $1 trillion anywhere else.
Let me drift off just a little bit here and get your take on the current Fed and the whole concept of raising interest rates or not. And I realize that at 25 basis points is not going to make or break an economy. But just in general, do you think the Fed is doing a reasonably good job, or are they being too passive? What's your take there?
Yeah, I think the Fed has an extremely difficult job right now. The use of monetary policy to create a healthy economy, it's a tool that kind of runs out of steam after a while. And I think it has reached that point. So it's going to be very difficult for them to find any monetary policy that is going to stimulate the economy the way fiscal policy can. But we can't use fiscal policy easily because we keep adding to the debt and running deficits we don't need to run, which is why I want to bring the budget closer to balance, we could then spend the money productively. But giving it back to people in the tax breaks that we offer now is a really bad way to operate fiscal policy. So monetary policy, I give reasonably high marks to. I think they are in the process of making adjustments that are needed. But fiscal policy, I think we've done a terrible job at.
Well, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but kind of we start to wind down here a little bit. One of your premises is the bank should be downsized. You did mention hedge funds ceasing to exist outside a successful and safe regulatory environment. Talk about downsizing of the banks. That feels it's a broad subject, obviously, but undoubtedly you've got some specific ideas.
Yeah, the very large banks don't really serve a purpose. Everything can be done with smaller banks. It used to be. It can still be done with smaller banks. And the very large banks create necessarily a systemic risk. The biggest problem is the one I alluded to earlier, the banks holding these huge derivative positions. The biggest banks seem to want to be in the derivatives business more than they want to be in the lending business, and that's not good. Smaller banks tend to lend. These big banks tend to do things in financial markets to try to make money by being smarter rather than by lending, and it's just not good for the economy. I think there's a quote that I love that I found somewhere. Winston Churchill said in 1925, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." Winston Churchill got it right. He didn't win that argument, but he got it right, and the answer is still the same.
Well, as we start to wind down here, Jim, you've got 5 concepts, 5 ideas you'd like to see explored. What can an individual, they're thinking, okay, you're talking healthcare reform, you're talking financial reform, you're talking tax policy changes, et cetera, but what can I, so to speak, as an individual do to affect any of this going forward?
Yes, that is a question I get a lot because democracy can be really frustrating. An individual says, I can't do much about this issue. All I got is one vote, and it's for a candidate. I don't even get to vote on the issues. But the answer is that in a democracy, vested interests are going to get to make all the decisions until the public says no. That's just the way a democracy works. If the public is passive, then vested interests are going to get to decide everything. When the public gets active, it can get whatever it wants. And so what I urge is that people be politically active. Go learn the issues. I mean, I obviously want them to read my book, but go learn the issues, go argue about these issues, and talk about them with your elected representatives. Vote, get active, and if enough people do that, then the public gets its way, and all these problems can be fixed.
Well, I appreciate very much your insights and your time. We've been talking to James M. Stone. He's the co-founder, and chairman and chief executive of Plymouth Rock Group of Companies, as well as serving as the former chairman and commissioner of the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission, amongst others. Brand new work, 5 Easy Theses. Jim, how can people find out more, get a copy of the book, and just do a little research on their own?
Yeah. Well, you can buy the book at most bookstores. You can buy the book through iTunes or Amazon, and I would encourage people to do that, 5 Easy Theses. There's also a pretty good website that we put together, which is www.5easytheses.com. It's got a quiz on it. It's got some videos. It's kind of fun, and it's attracted a following of its own. So I would hope people would look at the website and buy the book.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate the thoughts and observations, and best of luck, and let's have you on again sometime and see how things are progressing.
I'd love to. Thank you. This was a good interview. Thanks.
You bet. Hey, we'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.